The sheriff's deputy was standing on my porch, eviction notice in hand, when Margaret Thornfield pulled up in her pristine white Cadillac. She stepped out, wearing that smug smile I'd grown to despise, her perfectly manicured nails gleaming as she adjusted her oversized sunglasses. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I held the deed to her $1 million lakefront mansion. And in exactly 48 hours, I was going to use it to destroy her entire world. But let me back up 6 months, because this story starts with a lie. A lie that would cost Margaret everything she thought she controlled. It was March, when I inherited my grandfather's cabin on Crystal Lake. Nothing fancy, just a modest 2-bedroom retreat, with weathered cedar siding and a dock that had seen better decades. My grandfather, Samuel Chen, had built it with his own hands in 1987, long before the Lakewood Heights Homeowners Association existed. Long before people like Margaret Thornfield decided they owned the entire shoreline. The cabin sat on 2 acres of prime lakefront property, tucked between towering pines that filtered the morning light into golden streams across the water. It was peace incarnate. At least, it was supposed to be. I remember the first time I met Margaret. I was power washing the dock, music playing from my Bluetooth speaker, when this woman marched down my driveway like she owned the place. Designer hiking boots, yoga pants that probably cost more than my car payment, and an expression that screamed entitled suburbanite. "Excuse me?" she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm Margaret Thornfield, president of the Lakewood Heights HOA. We need to discuss your situation." I turned off the pressure washer, wiping my hands on my jeans. What situation would that be? Her laugh was cold, calculating. This entire property is in violation of at least 14 HOA regulations. Your dock extends beyond the permitted waterline. Your exterior paint doesn't match the approved color palette, and don't get me started on that eyesore of a shed. I looked back at my grandfather's workshop, the shed where he'd taught me to whittle, where we'd spent countless summer afternoons building birdhouses and fixing fishing reels. That shed's been here for 35 years. "Not anymore," Margaret said, pulling out her phone to snap photos. "The HOA was established in 1995, and all properties within our boundaries must comply with current standards. You have 30 days to bring this property into compliance, or face daily fines of $500. My blood ran cold. I never agreed to join any HOA. Margaret's smile widened like a shark sensing blood. When you inherited this property, you automatically assumed all obligations and covenants. It's in the deed transfer paperwork. Your lawyer should have explained. But here's the thing about lawyers. Sometimes they miss crucial details. Sometimes they don't dig deep enough into property records. And sometimes, just sometimes, they don't discover that the person threatening you doesn't actually have the authority they claim to have. That evening, I sat on my dock with a beer and my grandfather's old property documents. The sunset painted the lake in shades of amber and rose, but I couldn't enjoy it. Margaret's words echoed in my mind, all properties within our boundaries. I called my lawyer, Patricia Vance, a sharp woman in her 60s, who'd handled my grandfather's estate. "Pat, I need you to pull every document related to the Lakewood Heights HOA. Something doesn't feel right." "What kind of something?" she asked, and I could hear her keyboard clicking in the background. "The president claims my grandfather's property falls under their jurisdiction, but he built this place 8 years before the HOA existed. How is that possible?" The clicking stopped. "That's actually a very good question. Let me do some digging and call you back." 2 days later, my phone rang at 6 a.m. "Jake," Patricia's voice was tight with excitement. "You need to get down here, now. And bring coffee, because what I found is going to blow your mind." I drove to her office in town, my stomach churning with anxiety. Margaret had already sent 2 more violation notices, one for my unauthorized fire pit, another for having a pickup truck in my driveway instead of keeping it in an enclosed garage I didn't have. Patricia's office looked like a paper bomb had exploded. Property maps, legal documents, and survey reports covered every surface. She looked up at me with wild eyes, her gray hair escaping its usually perfect bun. "Jake, sit down. Your grandfather was a very smart man." She spread out a large map of Crystal Lake, marking property lines with red ink. The Lakewood Heights HOA was indeed established in 1995, but look at this. Her finger traced a boundary line that seemed to curve around my property like water around a rock. "They excluded your grandfather's land from the HOA boundaries?" I asked. "Not exactly." Patricia's grin was predatory. "They tried to include it, but your grandfather challenged the incorporation in court. He won. The court ruled that his property, having existed for 8 years prior to the HOA's formation and never having agreed to any covenants, remained independent. But here's the kicker." She pulled out another document, this one yellowed with age. "In 1998, 3 years after losing that court case, the HOA quietly amended their boundaries to exclude your grandfather's property completely. They had to. It was the only way to maintain their legal standing. But they never updated their covenant maps or their enforcement database." My coffee grew cold as the implications sank in. So when Margaret threatened me, she was operating under false information. Your property isn't just exempt from HOA rules, it was legally excluded from the HOA entirely. They have no authority over you whatsoever. But Patricia wasn't finished. Her next words would change everything. "Jake, there's something else. Something much bigger." She pulled out a thick file folder. "While researching your property, I discovered some irregularities in the HOA's property acquisitions over the years." She opened the folder, revealing dozens of property deeds, court documents, and transfer records. The Lakewood Heights HOA has been systematically targeting non-compliant properties for forced sales through aggressive fining and legal pressure. They acquire these properties at below-market prices, then flip them for enormous profits. My hands clenched into fists. "That's legal?" "Technically, yes. If a property owner can't pay accumulating HOA fines, the HOA can place a lion on the property and force a sale." "But Jake, look at this list of properties they've acquired." She handed me a spreadsheet. 43 properties over 15 years. All sold for 30–60% below market value. All bought by something called Thornfield Property Management, LLC. Margaret owns a property management company? Patricia nodded grimly. She's been using her position as HOA president to identify target properties, then orchestrating their acquisition through her private company. It's a massive conflict of interest, and in some cases, it borders on fraud. The pieces were clicking together like a deadly puzzle. So when she came after my property, she saw 2 prime acres of lakefront land she could acquire for pennies on the dollar through forced HOA compliance. Except she made one crucial mistake. She assumed your property was actually under HOA jurisdiction. I leaned back in my chair, mind racing. Margaret had overplayed her hand, but I was just one person against an entire HOA board and a woman who'd been running this scheme for over a decade. What could I possibly do? That's when Patricia dropped the nuclear bomb. "Jake, there's one more thing. When I was tracing property ownership records, I discovered something fascinating about Margaret's own home." She pulled out a property deed dated 2019. The Thornfield Mansion on Lakeshore Drive, the 3-story colonial with a private beach access? It's not actually owned by Margaret or her husband. My blood pressure spiked. "What do you mean?" "It's owned by Chen Holdings LLC, a company registered to." She paused for dramatic effect. "Your grandfather, Samuel Chen." The world tilted sideways. That's impossible. Patricia spread out more documents. In 2019, Margaret's property went into foreclosure. Her husband's construction business had failed, and they owed nearly $2 million in combined debts. The property was headed for auction when Chen Holdings, LLC stepped in and purchased the debt from the bank. She handed me another document, a rental agreement. Instead of foreclosing, your grandfather offered them a private rental arrangement. $1,200 a month for a $1 million lakefront mansion, with the understanding that they could purchase the property back when their finances recovered. My grandfather had never mentioned this. Not once. Patricia, my grandfather, died 18 months ago. Who's been collecting the rent? She smiled like a cat with a very large canary. The payments have been automatically deposited into the Chen Holdings account, which transferred to you along with all other estate assets. Jake, you are Margaret Thornfield's landlord. And, according to this lease agreement, she's 3 months behind on rent. The irony was so perfect it almost hurt. The woman who'd been trying to steal my property through fraudulent HOA claims was actually living in a house I owned. A house she couldn't afford to buy back. A house where she was currently violating her lease agreement by running an illegal business operation. What kind of lease violations are we talking about? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Patricia consulted her notes. The lease specifically prohibits using the property for business purposes. Margaret's been running her property management company out of the home office, hosting HOA board meetings in the living room, and storing acquisition documents in a converted basement office. All clear lease violations. She paused, letting that sink in. Jake, you could evict her tomorrow if you wanted. But tomorrow felt too soon. If I was going to take down someone who'd been systematically defrauding homeowners for 15 years, I needed to do it right. I needed to make sure she couldn't hurt anyone else ever again. Patricia, I need you to prepare a comprehensive legal strategy. I want to expose everything: the fraudulent property acquisitions, the conflict of interest, the lease violations. But I also want to document every illegal threat she's made against my property. What are you thinking? I stood up, feeling more determined than I'd been in months. I'm thinking Margaret Thornfield picked the wrong property owner to mess with. And I'm going to make sure she never forgets it. The next few weeks were a careful dance of documentation and preparation. I installed security cameras around my property, capturing every instance of HOA harassment. Margaret's violations of my boundaries became more aggressive. She sent inspectors who trespassed to photograph my shed, left threatening letters in my mailbox, and even called the county to file false reports about septic violations and unpermitted construction. Each action gave me more ammunition. But Margaret's biggest mistake came on a Tuesday morning in late April. I was having coffee on my dock when I heard voices carrying across the water. Margaret was on the beach behind her mansion, my mansion hosting what looked like an HOA board meeting. They'd set up a folding table and chairs right on the sand, with papers spread out in full view. I couldn't make out specific words, but I could see Margaret pointing toward my property, gesturing angrily. Other board members nodded and took notes. Someone had binoculars trained on my cabin. That's when I decided to get creative. I launched my grandfather's old kayak and paddled along the shoreline, staying far enough out to remain in public waters while getting close enough to hear their conversation. What I overheard made my blood boil. The Chen property is the last holdout on this stretch of shoreline, Margaret was saying. Once we acquire it through the compliance violations, we'll control the entire eastern peninsula. Another voice, one I recognized as board member Richard Paulson. What about his claims that he's not under HOA jurisdiction? His lawyer sent that letter. Margaret's laugh was harsh. Lawyers send threatening letters all the time. The deed clearly shows the property within our boundaries. We'll bury him in legal fees until he can't afford to fight anymore. A third voice, probably Treasurer Linda Walsh. Are you sure about the property boundaries? If we're wrong about this. We're not wrong, Margaret snapped. I've personally reviewed every property map. Besides, even if there were some technical boundary issue, we've established 25 years of precedent. No court would overturn that now. But it was her next words that sealed her fate. Once we acquire the Chen property, Thornfield Property Management will have exclusive development rights for the entire Eastern Shore. We're talking about a $30 million development opportunity, people. A few legal fees and some intimidation are a small price to pay for that kind of return. I paddled back to my dock with my phone's voice recorder full of evidence. Margaret had just confessed to orchestrating a fraudulent land grab while hosting the meeting on property she didn't own, in violation of her lease agreement, for the purpose of enriching her private company at the HOA's expense. It was time to spring my trap. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Patricia. I want to file a lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, trespassing, and attempted fraud. But I also want to serve Margaret with eviction papers for lease violations. And I want to do both on the same day. Patricia grinned. You want maximum chaos. I want justice. But yes, a little chaos wouldn't hurt. We spent the next week preparing our legal offensive. Patricia filed complaints with the State Attorney General's office regarding the HOA's fraudulent property acquisition scheme. She also prepared a detailed eviction notice citing Margaret's multiple lease violations, using the property for prohibited business purposes, hosting commercial meetings, storing business documents, and the final nail being 3 months behind on rent. But the PCDR sistance was the federal lawsuit we filed under RICO statutes. By proving the HOA had engaged in a pattern of fraudulent property acquisitions over 15 years, we could potentially expose them to criminal charges and massive financial penalties. The trap was set. Now I just needed to wait for Margaret to walk into it. She didn't keep me waiting long. On Monday morning, I was pressure washing my dock again, partly for maintenance, partly because I knew the sound would irritate Margaret when her Cadillac came flying down my driveway. She slammed the car door hard enough to rattle the windows and stormed toward me with a face like a thundercloud. You think you're clever, don't you? She screamed, waving a manila envelope. Filing frivolous lawsuits? Wasting the court's time with your ridiculous claims? I turned off the pressure washer and gave her my most innocent smile. I'm sorry, Margaret. What claims would those be? Don't play dumb with me. She threw the envelope at my feet. Your lawyer's little stunt isn't going to work. The HOA board has voted to accelerate enforcement actions against your property. As of today, you owe $47,000 in accumulated violations and fines. I picked up the envelope and examined its contents, a completely fabricated fine schedule for violations that didn't exist on property the HOA had no authority over. It was exactly the kind of overreach I'd been hoping for. 47,000? I whistled low. That's a serious number, Margaret. Almost as serious as the 3 months of unpaid rent you owe me. Her face went pale. What are you talking about? Oh, you didn't get the certified mail? That's strange, because according to my records, Margaret Thornfield of 1247 Lakeshore Drive owes Chen Holdings, LLC, exactly $3,600 in unpaid rent, plus late fees and lease violation penalties. The color drained from her face completely. That's impossible. Is it? Tell me, Margaret, who do you write your rent check to each month? Her mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. Chen Holdings, but that's. My landlord is some investment company in the city. Chen Holdings, LLC is registered to Samuel Chen of Crystal Lake, my grandfather, who passed away 18 months ago and left all his assets, including your lease agreement, to me. I pulled out my phone and showed her a photo of the lease. So technically, Margaret, you've been 3 months behind on rent to me. The same person you've been trying to illegally evict from his own property. Margaret's legs gave out. She sat down hard on my porch steps, staring at the lease agreement like it might bite her. But you can't. The HOA boundaries clearly show. The HOA boundaries as they exist in your enforcement database, yes. But not the legal boundaries as recorded with the county and established by court order in 1995. Would you like to see those documents too? I didn't wait for an answer. I pulled out Patricia's research folder and spread the original court ruling on the porch railing. Your HOA tried to include my grandfather's property when it was formed. He fought you in court. He won. The property was legally excluded from HOA jurisdiction and has remained so ever since. Margaret's hands were shaking as she read the court document. This can't be real. Oh, it's real. Just like the recording I made of last Tuesday's board meeting on the beach behind your house. You remember, the one where you discussed your plans to fraudulently acquire my property for development by Thornfield Property Management? Her head snapped up. You were spying on us? I was kayaking in public waters and overheard a conversation taking place on a beach. A beach behind a house you're renting from me, where you've been conducting illegal business meetings in violation of your lease agreement. The fight went out of her like air from a punctured balloon. She knew she was caught, but I wasn't finished. Not even close. Margaret, I want you to listen very carefully to what's going to happen next. In exactly 1 hour, you're going to receive 3 sets of legal documents. The first is a federal RICO lawsuit naming you, the HOA board, and Thornfield Property Management as defendants in a pattern of fraudulent property acquisitions dating back 15 years. Her face went gray. The second is a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's office, documenting your abuse of HOA authority for personal financial gain. That'll trigger a criminal investigation. She started to speak, but I held up my hand. The third is an eviction notice, giving you 30 days to vacate the premises at 1247 Lakeshore Drive for multiple lease violations and non-payment of rent. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Jake, please, you don't understand. If I lose the house, I'll lose everything. My husband's business is still struggling. We owe money everywhere. That house is the only thing keeping us afloat. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Margaret, you've spent the last 6 months trying to steal my grandfather's property through lies and intimidation. You've run a fraudulent scheme that's displaced dozens of families from their homes. You've used your position of authority to enrich yourself at the expense of the community you were supposed to serve. I stood up and looked down at her. You made your choices. Now you get to live with the consequences. That's when Margaret made her final mistake. Instead of accepting defeat gracefully, instead of trying to negotiate or make amends, she decided to go nuclear. She stood up, her face twisting with rage. You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with. I know people in this town, judges, city council members, the police chief. I'll bury you in legal problems you can't imagine. She pulled out her phone and started dialing. Hello, Sheriff Morrison? This is Margaret Thornfield. I need to report a break-in at my property. Yes, the perpetrator is still here. I watched in amazement as she literally called the police on me while standing on my own property. The audacity was breathtaking. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Morrison pulled up in his patrol car. He was a big man in his 50s, with a kind of mustache that belonged in a 1970s cop show. He walked up to us with the weary expression of someone who'd dealt with HOA disputes before. Margaret, he nodded to her, then turned to me. You must be Jake Chen. I've heard a lot about you lately. Margaret jumped in before I could respond. "Sheriff, this man has been harassing me for weeks. He's been kayaking around my property, taking pictures, and now he's on my porch, threatening me with fake legal documents." Sheriff Morrison looked around, taking in the scene. "Mrs. Thornfield, this is Mr. Chen's property, correct?" "Well, yes, but—" "And you came to his property to confront him?" Margaret's mouth snapped shut. The sheriff turned to me. "Mr. Chen, do you have any documentation regarding the legal issues Ms. Thornfield mentioned?" I handed him Patricia's folder. "Sheriff, I'd be happy to explain the situation, but I think these documents speak for themselves." He spent 10 minutes reviewing the papers, his eyebrows climbing higher with each page. Finally, he looked up at Margaret with an expression that could freeze lava. "Mrs. Thornfield, according to these documents, you've been attempting to collect HOA fines from property that's not under HOA jurisdiction. You've been trespassing on Mr. Chen's land to conduct inspections. And unless I'm reading this lease agreement wrong, you're currently 3 months behind on rent to Mr. Chen for your own residence." Margaret opened her mouth, but the sheriff wasn't finished. "Furthermore, Mr. Chen has recordings of you discussing plans to fraudulently acquire his property. That's conspiracy to commit fraud, ma'am, which is a felony." He folded up the documents and handed them back to me. "Mr. Chen, I suggest you provide copies of all this to the district attorney's office. Mrs. Thornfield, I strongly recommend you get yourself a good lawyer and stop harassing this man immediately." As Sheriff Morrison drove away, Margaret was left standing in my driveway, looking like someone who'd just watched her entire world collapse. Which, in fairness, she had. "Margaret," I said quietly, "you have one chance to make this right. Drop all HOA actions against my property immediately. Provide me with a written apology and a statement that my property has never been under HOA jurisdiction. Help me document the fraudulent property acquisitions so the families you've displaced can get justice." She looked up at me with desperate eyes. "And if I do that, I'll consider allowing you to stay in the house while you work out a payment plan for the back rent. I'm not trying to make you homeless, Margaret. I'm trying to stop you from hurting people." For a moment, I thought she might take the deal. I could see her weighing her options, calculating the odds of fighting versus surrendering. Then her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and her expression hardened. "I have to take this." She walked to her car and spent 15 minutes in heated conversation with someone. When she came back, the desperation was gone, replaced by cold determination. "Jake, I've just spoken with our HOA attorney. He assures me that your documents won't hold up in court. Possession is 9/10 of the law, and we've been treating your property as part of the HOA for 25 years. That creates legal precedent that trumps any technicalities in old court rulings." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Margaret, you just admitted to a sheriff that you've been committing fraud." I admitted to nothing, and good luck proving those recordings are admissible in court. She smiled that predatory smile again. "See, here's what's going to happen. You're going to pay the $47,000 in accumulated fines, or we're going to place a lion on your property and force a sale. My attorney says we can have you evicted within 6 months." She got back in her Cadillac and rolled down the window. "Oh, and Jake, regarding the rent situation, prove I owe you anything. The lease you showed me could easily be a forgery. Chen Holdings could be any number of shell companies. Unless you can definitively prove ownership in a court of law, I don't owe you a single penny." She drove away, leaving me standing in my driveway with a folder full of evidence and the growing realization that Margaret Thornfield was either completely delusional or far more dangerous than I'd imagined. That evening, I called Patricia with Margaret's response. Her reaction was immediate and explosive. She said, "What? Jake, please tell me you recorded that conversation." "Every word." "Perfect. because Margaret just made 3 critical legal errors that are going to destroy her. Patricia's voice was electric with excitement. First, she admitted to conspiracy. We've been treating your property as part of the HOA for 25 years, despite knowing they had no legal authority. Second, she threatened you with filing a fraudulent lion, which is extortion. Third, she essentially accused you of forging legal documents, which is defamation if she can't prove it. What does that mean for our case? It means we don't just have her for fraud and lease violations anymore. We have her for extortion, conspiracy, and defamation. Jake, I can probably get her criminally charged just from today's conversation. But Patricia wasn't finished. There's something else. While you were dealing with Margaret, I was digging deeper into the HOA's finances. Jake, they're broke. Completely insolvent. My blood chilled. What do you mean? The HOA has been operating at a massive loss for 3 years. They've been using money from forced property sales to cover basic operational expenses. If they can't acquire and flip your property, they'll be unable to meet their financial obligations to existing homeowners. The implications hit me like a freight train. So if I don't let them steal my property, the entire HOA could collapse financially. Existing homeowners could lose their home values, their common area maintenance, their security services. We're talking about affecting 200 families. I felt like I was drowning. Margaret hadn't just been targeting me, she'd been using my property as the keystone in a financial house of cards. If I brought her down, I might take the entire community with me. That night, I sat on my dock for hours, staring at the dark water and trying to figure out the right thing to do. Margaret had manipulated the system to hurt innocent people, but exposing her might hurt those same innocent people even more. Then I remembered something my grandfather used to say, Jake, sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing, but it's still the right thing. The next morning, I called Patricia with my decision. File everything. The federal lawsuit, the criminal complaints, the eviction notice. All of it. Jake, are you sure? We talked about the potential consequences. Patricia, Margaret, has been stealing people's homes for 15 years. She's threatened to steal mine through fraud and extortion. She's running an illegal business operation while living in a house she can't afford. And now she's trying to use 200 innocent families as human shields to protect herself from the consequences of her actions. I took a deep breath. If the HOA collapses, that's not on me. That's on Margaret and a board that let her run a criminal enterprise instead of a homeowners association. File everything. Okay, but Jake, there's something else you should know. I did some research into Margaret's background. Her husband's construction business didn't just fail, it failed because he was cutting corners on safety and materials. They've been sued 17 times in the last 5 years for defective work. The foreclosure on their house was just the tip of the iceberg. What are you saying? I'm saying Margaret Thornfield isn't just desperate. She's desperate and dangerous. People who have nothing left to lose can be unpredictable. Watch your back. Patricia's warning proved prophetic. Over the next week, as our legal filings made their way through the system, Margaret's harassment escalated to a level that bordered on stalking. She drove by my property multiple times each day, sometimes slowing down to take pictures, sometimes just sitting in her car, staring at my cabin. She filed noise complaints with the county whenever I used power tools. She called the health department claiming I had a septic leak. She even reported my truck as abandoned to have it towed from my own driveway. Each incident was petty, but together they created a pattern of intimidation that made my life miserable. I felt like I was under siege in my own home. Then, on Thursday morning, I woke up to find my dock had been vandalized. Someone had spray-painted THIEF and FRAUD across the wooden planks in bright red letters. They'd also cut the ropes on my kayak, letting it drift away across the lake. I called Sheriff Morrison immediately. He arrived within 30 minutes, took photos of the damage, and listened to my suspicions about Margaret. "Mr. Chen, I understand your frustration, but I can't arrest someone based on suspicion alone. Do you have any evidence Mrs. Thornfield was responsible for this?" I didn't, but I was about to get some. That afternoon, I installed additional security cameras with night vision capability around my entire property perimeter. If Margaret or her associates tried anything else, I'd have them on video. I didn't have to wait long. At 2:47 a.m. on Saturday morning, my security system detected motion near my shed. I woke up to alerts on my phone and watched in real time as two figures in dark clothing approached my property. One was carrying what looked like a crowbar, the other had a backpack full of supplies. They weren't trying to break into my cabin, they were trying to break into my shed. My grandfather's workshop, the building Margaret had called an eyesore during our first confrontation. I called 911 while watching the break-in unfold on my phone. The intruders spent 20 minutes inside the shed, and when they emerged, they were carrying several of my grandfather's antique woodworking tools worth thousands of dollars and absolutely irreplaceable in sentimental value. The police arrived just as the thieves were loading their stolen goods into a dark SUV. They arrested both men on the spot, recovered all the stolen tools, and most importantly discovered that one of the thieves was Margaret's nephew, Danny Paulson. When Sheriff Morrison interrogated Danny, the whole conspiracy unraveled. Margaret had hired him and his friend to steal from my property, hoping to make it look like random theft. But her real goal was to plant evidence in my shed that would support HOA claims about unpermitted structures and safety violations. Danny had been carrying falsified building permits and safety inspection reports that Margaret planned to discover during a follow-up HOA investigation. She was going to claim my shed was illegally constructed and therefore subject to immediate demolition. It was insurance fraud, evidence tampering, and conspiracy all rolled into one desperate scheme. When the sheriff called Margaret to inform her that her nephew had been arrested for burglarizing my property, her reaction was recorded on the jail's phone system. She screamed at Danny for getting caught, threatened to disown him if he cooperated with police, and in the moment that sealed her fate, admitted she'd given him detailed plans of my property layout and told him exactly which tools to steal. Margaret Thornfield had just confessed to conspiracy, burglary, and evidence tampering on a recorded jail phone call. The arrest warrant was issued the next morning. I was having coffee on my dock, watching the sunrise paint the lake in shades of gold and pink, when the sheriff's cars pulled into Margaret's driveway. From across the water, I could see her being led out in handcuffs, her perfect hair disheveled, her designer pajamas wrinkled and stained with tears. Her husband Richard stood in the doorway, looking like a man watching his entire life collapse. Their teenage daughter was crying on the porch, and neighbors had gathered to witness the spectacle. I should have felt satisfied. This was justice, after all. Margaret had tried to steal my property, harassed me for months, and finally resorted to criminal conspiracy. She deserved everything that was happening to her. But mostly, I just felt sad. Sad for her family, who were paying the price for her crimes. Sad for the homeowners, who would suffer when the HOA's financial crimes were exposed. Sad that it had come to this at all. My phone rang. It was Patricia. "Jake, it's over. Margaret's been arrested. The HOA board has voted to immediately drop all enforcement actions against your property, and the state attorney general has opened a full investigation into their financial practices." What happens now? Now comes the hard part. The criminal trial, the civil lawsuits, the financial recovery efforts. It's going to take years to sort out all the damage Margaret caused, and a lot of innocent people are going to get hurt in the process. Patricia paused. "But Jake, You should know you're not just getting justice for yourself. I've already been contacted by 7 families who lost their homes to Margaret's scheme. Your evidence is going to help them get their properties back. That afternoon, I drove to the county courthouse to review the charges against Margaret. The list was extensive: conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, evidence tampering, burglary, filing false police reports, and about a dozen other felonies related to her 15 years of HOA corruption. Her bail was set at $500,000 money her family didn't have after losing their construction business and falling behind on debts. Margaret would be staying in jail until trial. But the story didn't end with Margaret's arrest. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded to include the entire HOA board and several local officials who had helped facilitate the fraudulent property acquisitions. Richard Paulson, the board member who'd questioned Margaret's authority during that beach meeting, turned state's evidence in exchange for immunity. He provided prosecutors with 15 years' worth of financial records, meeting minutes, and internal communications that documented the systematic targeting of vulnerable homeowners. Linda Walsh, the treasurer, was arrested for embezzlement after investigators discovered she'd been skimming HOA dues to fund Margaret's property acquisition scheme. The secretary, David Kim, was charged with filing fraudulent liens and forged documents. Even Sheriff Morrison came under scrutiny after investigators discovered he'd been accepting campaign contributions from Thornfield Property Management in exchange for refusing to investigate homeowner complaints against the HOA. Within 3 months, the entire power structure of Lakewood Heights had collapsed. The HOA was dissolved, its assets seized by the state to compensate victims of the fraud scheme. Properties that had been illegally acquired were returned to their original owners or their heirs. But the most satisfying moment came 6 weeks after Margaret's arrest, when I received a